So far, we've learned how to create elements, add text to the inner HTML element, select elements, add elements to other elements, add style to elements. But how would we go about listening to events? So when something clicks or when something gets changed, we can add what's called an event listener to our elements so that we can listen and trigger a function based on certain events. So if I go back to my inner HTML file here, I'm going to add a button. I'm going to call click me to turn the page red. So if we go back to our document here, see we've got a button, but it doesn't do anything at the moment. But how would we listen for that button? How would we want to get access to that button? So I'm going to start by putting a class name on this, or I'm going to put an ID on this. When using query selector, we can select by a lot of different things. We can select by the element tag, which usually isn't a great idea because, you know, in the case of the body, obviously there's only going to be one body, but it's very, very likely you're going to have multiple divs, multiple buttons. So it's usually better to either select via the class name or via the ID. So if we add an ID to this button, go ID equals, call it red button. Naming's hard. So we're going to go here. I'm going to go start by const button equals document dot query selector. And we'll go like that, and we're going to use the hash for the ID, and then we called it, I'm just going to copy it here to make sure there's no typos, red button. Perfect. So now we selected that, and we can prove we've selected it by changing the inner HTML of the button. So we've written, click me to turn the page red, right? Click me to turn the page red. What we can do, actually, what I'm going to do first is actually going to add a class. Actually, I'm not going to add a class. Never mind. But we can change. Let's change the inner HTML of this button to prove that we've actually selected. So we'll go button dot inner HTML, and then we'll set that equal to new button inner HTML. So now we can see right there. Our button. Let's make that a smidge bigger. Is now new button inner HTML. But still, we have no way of doing anything with it. But just as we've accessed this .inner HTML property, we can also access the property I mentioned earlier called button.add event listener. Now, what does add event listener really do? Let's look it up in the docs again. So it takes an event target, which in our case is going to be an element, and sets up a function that will be called whenever the specified event is delivered to the target. Common targets are elements, which is what we're dealing with. We can add event listeners to the document or even the window. So you're not limited to just your elements. You can go higher and higher and higher if you want to. And this might be a bit hard to read. I think it is, but this is the general syntax. So you start by listing the type of event you want to listen for. You pass it a listener function, and then you can also optionally pass it some options. Let's see if they've got some proper examples here. Yeah, so window that add event listener. Well, let's go back to our code now. So we're going to call this function add event listener. Let's listen for the click event. So list of events. Event listeners. So this is more or less a list of events that I think, let's see if they've got click in here. Yeah, so these are a list of the mouse events that we've got access to us, but mouse events aren't limited to, events aren't limited to just mice. So you could even add an event listener to the whole page to listen for presses on the keyboard. You can listen to when you paste something and maybe you want to change the color red. I highly recommend you search MDM events and then look at all of the different things that you can play around with when adding an event listener. You can listen to virtually any event and do any sort of action. Now that you know how to create and add elements to the document, it's basically like having superpowers. So we're just going to do a mouse event right now, and we're going to add click, and then we're going to pass a function as a second argument. And this is a bit of a new syntax here, but you can pass functions as arguments. And to do that, we'll define a function. We can define it just in line, or if it's easier, we can actually, let's define it in line and then we'll move it out afterwards. So we can go function, we'll call it event, we'll call it on click. So function on click. And what do we want to do when this click is called? Let's just start by console.log. So console.log, it was clicked. So now suddenly our click is doing something. We've added an event listener, we passed in a function, and that function gets run now when that event is triggered or when it's heard. So that means every time a click occurs on this button, we get a click. So this means we can start making things dynamic. So if we want to change the background of the whole document to red, on click, we can take our body tag from up here, body.style.background equals red. So now when I click this button, it turns the page red. One thing that I encourage you to explore on your own is the argument that we get on click here in our event handler function. So right here, and this is going to seem really strange, we get access to an event. And normally when you're defining functions, so if I were, let's move this out here. I can just pass the name of this function here. So let's console.log this event. So we get a mouse event. So exactly what we read under here, this is a mouse event. And that is actually also just an object full of properties that let us act on that event. So there's actually a ton of stuff here. Most of it you're probably not going to use, but it gives you the flexibility to do pretty much anything and react to events in any such way. And it really gives you a level of depth and complexity that can enable you to build virtually anything you can think of. I mean, you can see some of these don't make sense to us yet, like cancel bubble, cancelable. Now, just to reiterate, we're not limited to just things that make sense to click. Like I said, we can listen to events on anything. So for example's sake, let's take our H1 here, or let's take our body. We can add an event to the body tag and listen if there's any key presses while we're inside the body tag. Or I guess let's add that to the document. Let's add that to the document instead. So let's go to our JavaScript. So we can go document.add event listener. We want to listen to key down. And let's add a function here. Call another function on key down. And then we'll just console.log key went down. So this is going to happen, in theory, this should happen whenever I press a key when we're focused within our DOM there. So key went down, I'm just typing on my keyboard here. So just to prove to you, boom, 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 we can see it's logging out every time there. That is more or less the extent of adding events, listening to events, adding elements to the DOM, manipulating elements, and doing everything. It can get very big, very fast. However, I hope in these simple examples I've illustrated how big the possibilities are at allowing us to create very rich and dynamic websites which our users can interact with.